which is found in the second section of the Bible, commonly called the New Testament. Today's reading is on page 4 of the New Testament. You can access the reading on your tablet or smartphone via our guest internet access. From Matthew chapter 5, verses 18 through 37. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you idiot, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Blessings on this reading of Holy Scripture this morning. I know we often feel a lot better about ourselves when we have met the qualifications. Even if the qualifications were minimum, but the standard was presented and we met that standard. whether it was all you could have given or the most you had ever given, doesn't really matter all that much because you've met the minimum qualifications. Now, once again, we're reminded that fulfillment here doesn't mean satisfied or appeased. As Jesus is speaking to the disciples and those who have gathered from his healing acts and miracles, he's offering this expansive view of the very teachings of the law and the prophets that don't raise qualifications or give the maximum possible level. Contrary to what you may have heard about this reading, Jesus isn't expounding upon obligations and into the true meaning, spirit, and substance of Moses' instructions here, that not only looks at those outward signs and actions, but also the very motivations of our thoughts, our intentions, and our own moral sense. In other words, how those who hunger and thirst for justice, who are pure in heart, who are peacemakers, go beyond all the checked boxes, beyond the greater righteousness of that group we will call the Jerusalem Religious Industrial Complex, otherwise known as the scribes and Pharisees. Because what Jesus is doing here, when he talks about in those ancient times you have heard it said, he's talking about several of Moses' teachings and draws deeper than either the scribes nor the Pharisees were ever willing to go. On murder, on adultery, on divorce, on oaths and vows, because for both followers and non-followers can likely agree at the bare minimum that it's not good to kill anyone. It may cross your mind in a momentary situation of temper or defense, but I think it's safe to say that actually taking the steps towards taking someone else's life is one step too far for anyone here. But for those who thirst and hunger for justice, who are pure in heart, who are peacemakers in God's kingdom, also sense the danger that is involved with just anger alone. Because anger in itself is expressing a defense from an assault. And it is where anger can take us in a real and present danger. For anger often brings about a verbal assault, as if our own words are weapons that can be used to maim and to ultimately kill an opponent. And once again, we begin our verbal assault with the dehumanization of the other in context. It nearly always escalates, doesn't it not, to insults, just as hurtful, shameful, and painful as if real weapons were being used here. It's not enough to not act on a desire to harm. It is just as destructive to the community to assault one another with words and insults. When you still desire the worst outcome for another fellow human being, do not be too shocked to discover that your opposition also desires the same outcome for you. Those who hunger and thirst for justice or are pure in heart, or peacemakers desire reconciliation rather than revenge, even in the midst of any heated conflict. Before you even take your disagreement to that punitive phase where judges and courts often announce favor, Jesus calls us to make peace on the way. While anger, insults, or name-calling of others as if you could murder someone with your own words is just as life-threatening as killing another human being. Jesus is going to broaden another teaching of Moses from simply the actions of adultery to include even the pursuit of or making someone an object of your own desire. But it is not the responsibility of the other person here to become less desirable. It is totally the responsibility of the one who has such motivations in the first place to possess anyone that isn't theirs, to remove those distorted ideas and habits that make even considering ownership a possibility. Take out your eye, cut off your arm, do what is necessary to remove. Wanting someone also has consequences when considering no longer desiring what you already had. If you no longer have desire for your spouse, it is not enough to merely dismiss the formerly desired person. That certificate of divorce that Jesus is talking about. A committed relationship in God's kingdom will demonstrate the mutual companionship with or without the desire to possess, and without expelling the commitment when it's no longer desirable. And when it comes to even making oaths or vows, if you need something else attached to it to keep the oath, then simply don't make them. If your word is always truthful and spoken with integrity, then the simplest of statements, whether it is yes or no, should be enough. Jesus here is not adding nor removing a single letter of the teachings of Moses, nor the writings of the prophets here. In contrast to all these common interpretations that the Jerusalem religious industrial complex has been offering, his instructions counter that anger can be as dangerous to life as murder, that lust or desire or cravings can be just as dangerous as breaking marriage vows, and that separating a loving relationship when desire has simply faded can be just as dangerous as making vows you do not ever intend to really keep, or making vows with some form of collateral, whether heaven, earth, or Jerusalem, or the very hairs on your head, should not be necessary to those who love God and neighbor faithfully and wholeheartedly. Because Jesus here reveals to us that divided hearts will lead to divided minds. And anger or desire often prohibits those two things we do need: friendship and respect. Callous disregard for a spouse often prohibits kindness and personal responsibility to the spouse. And oaths with collateral often declare how untrustworthy your statements are in the first place. So Jesus is calling us through a path of minimums and a list of do-nots and into a way of life that will show the love of God and love of neighbor, and even offer the guidance towards the path and the seasoning to savor it. Remember, we are already called salt of the earth and light to all mankind. So how are these religious teachings not raising these standards? Doesn't it sound like Jesus is raising standards? He seems to be countering at every turn the Jerusalem religious industrial complex on a pretty good boatload of major issues here. It has often been interpreted as that very action proving that we are completely incapable of fulfilling or satisfying God's purposes or standards in the first place. But I think the secret is the fact that there's so many practical responses included in the teaching that shows that Jesus is not saying we can't do it. Often or not, he's saying we haven't even tried to act on God's purposes or standards. We can watch our anger so that it doesn't necessarily lead down the path of judgment. We can refrain from insults, especially between each other, without getting a counsel involved. And rather than joining that endless game of name-calling, we can choose not to participate at all. Even during a religious ceremony such as leaving your gift at the altar, we should be expected to leave it if it means we can reconcile, and to offer forgiveness repeatedly and regularly. Think for a moment how many fewer court cases there would be if you would come to terms with your accuser, and if only friendship was more desired than revenge. We can take the necessary actions to no longer engage in the habits or behaviors which make people into objects for our possession or commodities for our personal use, even to the point of discarding. And if our yes or no is truly our answer, pulling God into the statement is unnecessary. The teachings will never be abolished. Jesus says that, but we will always set those who desire to follow God upon the proper path. Not with minimum standards that even non-followers of God can meet without effort. It is not when we are prohibited that demonstrates our devotion and love of God or neighbor. It is how our friendship and respect rules our lives, how kindness and responsibility rules our relationships, and how our words compel us to fulfill our duties and tasks. Now, at times we will fail in this. But there's also opportunities to succeed in this. Because for every setback we face, there is still outrageous grace provided for us. And when we succeed, may we have that same grace to encourage those who have failed to strive again. Those who strive for justice as much as food and drink. Those who seek purity in their heart, and those who desire to make peace. When reconciliation can happen along the way to court, when altars bearing gifts are abandoned to seek forgiveness, when relationships are too valuable to draft up separation papers, and when oaths require no collateral, then God's purpose and desire will walk among us in human flesh, in our communities, and with